Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's May 28th, 2026. I'm Jeff. Joining me is my co-host, Ness. First, we're going to continue on what Ness did in the solo episode by talking about the continuing fallout of the 4th Congressional Kentucky primary GOP election that occurred last week. First, some background on Kentucky's 4th Congressional District. It is not Appalachia. It is not a district of working class whites. It is, by Kentucky standards, wealthy, suburban. The district covers 20 counties along the Ohio River's northern Kentucky bank. The population of the district is 776,000. It's about 68% urban and 32% rural. It is basically mostly the Kentucky side suburbs of Cincinnati. It's east of Louisville. The poverty rate is 7.5%, whereas the nationwide average is 12.4%. It is the most wealthy district in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. It's about 87% white, and the Cook Political Report rates it as Republican plus 18. So the narrative that was expressed, at least on the dissident rights or populist side, was that the Jews stole the election, that they came in and injected a ton of money into the race and essentially stole the election. And I think Tucker Carlson is a good exemplar of the general pro-Massey side.
The term stole might be a little bit loaded. I think the consensus would be that these Zionists' interest purchased the election. There are some rumblings about alleged mail-in ballots, but those assessments are very sloppily constructed. The headline being that Gallrein won by a little over 10,000 votes, and there were a little over 10,000 mail-in votes that he received. Ergo, those mail-in ballots were fraudulent, and that was the difference. And also, Thomas Massie must not have received any mail-in ballots, except he did receive thousands of them. And so this isn't really something that is seriously being bandied about by any of the dissident voices that I'm familiar with. I think the criticism is more that the massive injection of money and Trump's eye of Sauron focus on the 4th Congressional District is what ended up tilting it in Gallrein's favor, not that it was outright stolen.
So you believe that the election was conducted on the up and up, in the sense that all of the votes, or the vast majority of the votes cast, were by legitimate Kentucky residents, American citizens?
Well, I would never be so foolish as to say that all of the votes are legitimate, because I think that is almost categorically not the case. But I do not think there is any reason to think that it was the outcome was necessitated by some sort of fraudulent activity. But I do take for granted that there is always some level of fraud that occurs when it comes to trying to achieve power.
Well, the episode you did last week, the implicit premise, I think, of it was that you were going off the assumption that the election was conducted fairly and legitimately, in the sense that, like I said, the votes cast were by people who had the legal right to cast the votes.
Yes, I'm a polling respecter, and so I think that definitely seems plausible.
Ness thinks that I have a gamma obsession with Tucker Carlson, and I can't really argue with that, but I'm going to bring him up again here. He released or made a statement. I guess Ness informed me that what I'm about to read is what he delivered verbally in his monologue. I think this is dated May 20th, so very shortly after the election, quoting Tucker Carlson.
We don't actually need to quote him in our own words. We will allow him to speak in his own words via an excerpt from the monologue Jeff is referring to.
Covered a lot of victory parties in my life, a lot, more than 10, and some lost parties too. That's the weirdest thing I've ever seen. There's no one there. What percentage of the people in that room know Ed Gallrein or are related to him? Are his neighbors were paid to be there? We don't know the answer. There's nobody there. So how'd this guy win? Well, he won on mail-in ballots. And we'll sort of leave it to online sleuths to determine whether that's legitimate or not. Who knows? Because if you're willing to pour tens of millions of dollars into a Republican primary in the 4th District of Kentucky, you're probably willing to do whatever it takes. And maybe they did. We don't know that. Not alleging it. But we do know that's not what democracy looks like. Democracy is the process by which people express their will, by which they say, this is how we want our country to be run because it's our country. It doesn't belong to Miriam Adelson or Paul Singer or Israel or Big Pharma for that matter or any other small group of rich people. It's not the plaything of billionaires. That doesn't belong to the oligarchs. It belongs to us. And here's what we want. And you can't ignore us because we're the owners here. And this is shareholders meeting and we're voting. And when people win in a race like this, there's evidence of it. And that evidence takes very familiar forms. Enthusiasm, joy, and just sheer numbers. Like people show up, they can't believe it. We beat the evil Thomas Massie with his jihadi backers. This is a blow against Islamic Jihad, whatever that is. Islamic Jihad, which along with Hamas is one of the big problems in the 4th District of Kentucky. They've been very, very concerned about Islamic Jihad and Hamas and Hezbollah for a long time in Covington. But anyway, there was no such display. And so it makes you wonder, this election itself, was it another part of the humiliation ritual? Was it a way of saying to the rest of us, people who sort of believed in democracy, it's all fake? We can get a guy whose last name we can't pronounce elected on a platform everybody in America hates because we can. Because we're billionaires and you're not. And of course our priorities are not aligned with yours. In fact, we hate your priorities and we hate you. We're going to do this to you anyway. Even in Kentucky, we can do it. It's possible that's the message they were sending. Pretty certain, actually. So on one level, this is the saddest moment in a long time.
There's a lot to unpack there. I know that pointing out lies and hypocrisies and inconsistencies about Tucker Carlson is like shooting fish in a barrel, but I can't help myself. He was mocking the very idea that jihad and Islamism and Islamic terror is a concern. That's quite a different tone than he was striking when he was on Fox News. Just one example, in December 2015, he was on Hannity, and they were doing a special, Tucker and Hannity. The title of the episode was Dual Threat, Political Correctness and Jihad. And Tucker warned that Americans were, quote, being put in grave danger because some politicians continue to lie about the threat we face from Islamic terror abroad. And then in 2017, he said violent terrorism was an inevitability in Europe because of Muslim population growth. I'm not sure exactly what's changed since then, but...
What's changed since then, briefly, is that he has had the entire corporate media apparatus, including his previous employer, turn against him for questioning some of the presuppositions that he took for granted throughout his public career as a bow tie wearing person who wrote for National Review and was a reliable neoconservative voice with a sort of soft spot for the John Bolton style of America First imperialism that overlapped a lot with neo-Connery but wasn't exactly the same thing. And then when he started to question a lot of those assumptions, he first drew a lot of heat and a lot of fire in the corporate media world, but was able to stay on at Fox for a number of years because he was the highest rated show in cable television, but he was still ostracized in his last few years at Fox. And then when he took those same sort of criticisms of the military industrial state that were at play throughout the war on terror era and applied them to Russia and Ukraine, he finally got the boot from Fox, and once out in the wilderness, he continued down that trail and found that there was a lot more to recommend those criticisms and critiques of Israel first driven American foreign policy. And he has said as much himself. I am sure that he would repudiate those statements that he made back in definitely in 2015. 2017 is a little tougher because you can mock the idea of Hamas or Hezbollah jihad. Both of those are organizations that have virtually no presence at all in the United States. But you can mock that while understanding that should not be conflated with the problems that large-scale Islamic immigration brings with it in terms of social dysfunction and the like. Just because it's not religiously jihad-driven doesn't mean that having tens of millions of Middle Easterners pour in to Western Europe or to America is somehow a beneficial thing to have happen. The TLDR on it is that the Tucker Carlson of 2015 was a neocon Zionist, and the Tucker Carlson of 2026 is not. And the Tucker Carlson of 2026 has spent the last 5 years repenting and repudiating the beliefs that the Tucker Carlson of 2020 and before held.
Repenting is a bit of a strong word. What actual cost has he paid in any way for expressing the 180s that he's made?
He lost his position at Fox News.
I would argue that was primarily because of his behavior around the Dominion voting systems. Now, as a Fox and the Pareto framework that we've discussed before, he certainly has a vested interest in portraying himself as a martyred truth teller who suffered was defenestrated from Fox because he was just so intent on telling the truth at any cost. I think if you look into the actual details surrounding that, I don't buy that. I am more cynical of the interpretation. I would explain his shift on this specific issue and probably other issues, that this issue about this the danger he viewed Islamic Jihad and the casual, flippant nature that he describes it as now, that big contrast between the two approaches to that. I would argue when he was at Fox News, he was making a lot of money, and that's what was expected. That was what was expected of Fox hosts at the time. And now that he's in the independent media space, there is, especially since October 7th, there is just a almost insatiable desire for anti-Israel content, and Tucker is filling that fulfilling that market demand.
Well, definitely his legion of detractors saw it as a victory that a racist and a bigot and an anti-Semite, to a large extent, was removed from Fox. Whatever the ultimate reason behind it was, it did definitely correspond to Tucker Carlson's increasing hostility to American support for Ukraine in the proxy war against Russia. And there are a lot of things that Fox News tries to portray itself as being on the opposite side of the establishment, the neoliberal establishment, such as it is. But when it comes to military action in Ukraine, even more so than in Israel, the consensus throughout the so-called right and the left of the corporate media are all uniform in their their undying support for Ukraine and opposition and allergy to anything that could be perceived as potentially sympathetic to Russia. And I think that is what ultimately was the genesis of Tucker Carlson's firing.
So getting back to the Tucker's monologue and the Kentucky primary race, it's obvious to me, anyway, that Tucker is unwilling or afraid. Maybe he's learned about the liability he was at risk of during the Dominion lawsuit, the defamation lawsuit. Maybe he's more careful now with his words, but I'm not even sure this would just... I guess he thinks that if you just make an accusation and then you follow it up with not alleging it, that just negates it. I don't think that's how it works. But so I don't really know why he wouldn't just come right out and say it. This indirect plausible deniability. I'm not really sure what that's about, but he's obviously indicating that he thinks there was fraud in the election, some shenanigans with the mail-in ballots. And he says democracy is the process by which people express their will. So he's apparently believes in democracy, and the people, we both believe, Ness and I, from what we can tell, democracy, whether you like it or not, was fulfilled, was played out pretty effectively and correctly in the primary election in Kentucky. And so Tucker, he claims he likes democracy, so he's really only left with two choices. He can say that the people are stupid of Kentucky. He's obviously not going to say that because he supposedly speaks for kind of the heritage America, flyover Americans that are in Kentucky. I mean, it's like 85, 90% white. I've been to that area. It's salt of the earth people. So he can basically either say those people are stupid and easily manipulated, or the election was stolen. There's no evidence that the election was stolen, so I don't really know what do you think, Ness? What do you make of it?
That mass democracy in a social media age is a recipe for political disaster, and I wouldn't be surprised if Tucker Carlson would be willing to admit that in private, but the reality is if he came out and criticized democracy as such because the outcome of this election didn't go the way that he wanted it to go, then he would lose a lot of the popularity that he has. And so he's working within the framework, within the Overton window, which in the West is that democracy is synonymous with good government, or at least, even though democracy might not be sufficient for good government, it is at least necessary for good government. And so he has to operate on those premises and then try to criticize the outcome from that position. Because, yes, you characterized it well, that if you state that you believe in democracy, but the outcome of a democratic contest doesn't go your way, then you either have to allege that it wasn't conducted fairly or the people made the wrong decision. Parenthetically, I think there is vanishingly few people who actually support democracy for the sake of being democracy. It is something that is coded as a positive value, something that has to be praised and cannot be criticized. But the reality is that people will definitely, when it comes to democracy, cheat to win.
And if you accept that democracy is a good thing, in this district, I think it's a positive development that this election had much higher turnout than the previous elections. The previous primary elections in this Kentucky district. And so those, white heritage Americans that didn't express their view, this time they did, and they voted for Ed Gallrein, and they are also big Trump supporters. And the fact is that while Massie largely voted in line with Trump, he was, I believe, an outlier. He certainly voted against Trump's agenda more than the average Republican. And those Kentucky voters love Trump for the most part. So, it just makes perfect sense why they would vote against Massie.
Perhaps, although Gallrein himself was an anti-Trumper in 2016, and as Jeff laid out here, this is not at all a typical Trump-supporting district. This is very much a district demographically that is constituted disproportionately compared to the rest of the country of the non-MAGA Republican types, the types of people who are Republicans but who are not Trump supporters. The outcome would be more explicable if it was in the heart of Appalachia, if this was in West Virginia, coal mining country or something. But this is in a relatively affluent, mostly suburban area of the country. The type of Northern Virginia Republicans are the types of people who are here, not the MAGA hat wearing populists that propelled Trump in 2016 and to a lesser extent than in 2024. The pushback to the way that Jeff characterized it as something that should be celebrated as an instance of democracy growing, because we alluded to it in 2022, which was the last time that Massie ran in a primary where he was challenged, where there was an actual contest between two different or multiple candidates vying for the Republican nomination. There were 66,000 votes cast in the primary. This time there were over 100,000 in just 4 years' time. So this is a massive increase in turnout. And so in some sense, you could say, well, that is a positive development for democracy. But if you take into account the amount of money spent per vote cast, the amount of political campaign dollars spent per voter was far, far higher in 2026 than in 2022. So if the question is money spent, is that in principle distinguishable from simply bribing voters? If voters were sent $50 for every person who pledged that they would go out and vote for Gallrein, you could have greater turnout, which in some sense would be the democratic process in action. Higher electoral turnout means that democracy is working well. And so would that be something that would also be good for democracy, simply bribing voters? And that is the question, of course, is political campaign spending, is that tantamount to effective bribery? Or if not outright bribery, then the consequence of effective marketing, effective advertising. In other words, is democracy at its best when people spend a ton of money to manipulate people into voting the way that they want those people to vote?
I think manipulate might be too strong of a word. I would like to know, and it's surprisingly hard to track down, at least it was for me, what precisely was all of this money spent on, and how did all these millions of dollars translate? What was the mechanism whereby dollars flowed in and that turned into people voting for either switching from Massie to Gallrein or voting for the first time in a primary? Because I saw the obvious one is just advertisements on terrestrial TV. And I guess that makes sense for the boomers because they disproportionately still watch traditional television. And so in local Kentucky markets, perhaps they saw a bunch of anti-Massie ads and ads. I know there was one, I couldn't find the actual ad, but apparently there's an ad of Massie. It's an AI generated ad of Massie congregating with the squad. That's like AOC and Ilhan Omar, and basically implying that he was cohorting, he was interacting with them and betraying Trump, but going over to the dark side.
It was that plus an enormous door knocking campaign of paid campaign members rather than volunteers, in contrast to how a lot of political campaigns are run, especially at the congressional level, out of necessity, because the dollars raised simply aren't anywhere near enough to pay an army of people to go paint the town in your preferred candidates' election material.
I just wouldn't characterize, even if they are paid, people who are knocking on people's doors voluntarily, the people can answer or not or tell them to get lost. I wouldn't characterize that as manipulation. I guess this is more just a critique of, I guess, the very concept of democracy, because if you believe in the virtue and wisdom of the common man to make those decisions, I don't think their autonomy is negated because some paid person knocks on their door and speaks with them for a few minutes, or even if they see some Trump or anti-Massie AI generated ad. If that's enough to sway people, I think again that's a critique of democracy itself.
Or it's a realization that truth again is just incidental, and that if you want to achieve power, then lying is the way to do it. You just mentioned the AI ad that insinuated that Thomas Massie is somehow political bedfellows with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
I think there was also, I'm not for sure on this. I don't know if it was Massey directly or some of the PACs affiliated with him, but I think there were some anti-Gallrein ads as well. I couldn't find them, but I think there was one where Gallrein was like on the field of battle and he was shown deserting Trump, basically like not supporting Trump adequately, which is also bizarre that Trump would so viciously and dishonorably treat Massey as he did, and then Massey basically say, no, I love Trump and I voted for him all the time. It's just kind of unfortunately, I think it's kind of a pathetic response to someone attacking you, saying how much you love them. But I suppose Massey felt like he had to do that in order to have any chance of winning the primary.
Yes, this is the age-old question. Is it better to be a principled loser or to do what you need to do to win? And clearly, Massey's campaign understood that being perceived as an enemy of Trump was not something that was going to redound to his benefit in a Republican primary in Kentucky.
But to push back on that, and to give Massey some credit, I think, for standing on principle or standing on business, as the kids say these days, he certainly did not have to go after Israel, and he could have. He's a congressman from Kentucky. He could have kept his mouth shut about what was happening in Gaza. He certainly didn't need to stick his neck out and push very hard and work with Ro Khanna to get the Epstein Transparency Act and basically force the hand of the Department of Justice to release the Epstein files. I mean, if his motivation was just to win re-election, he would not have done all of those things.
He was trying to, and up through 2026, it looked like it was something that he could maintain successfully, to be a sort of gadfly Republican who brought a very libertarian, shaded, holding feet to the fire rhetorically, and it increased his brand and his notoriety quite a bit to do so. But I think what he did is he, in political terms, flew a little too close to the sun and got a little bit too antagonistic towards Trump. And when I used the Eye of Sauron reference before, when he was just spatting with Trump here and there, it was something that in a lot of ways benefited both of them. But when Massey became perceived as a direct challenge to Trump's legislative agenda and Trump turned on him, that is when Massey realized that his position, that I'm sure he did think was safe in 2024, he literally didn't even have anybody challenge him, didn't even have anybody run against him. And so, as uncommon as it is for incumbents to lose, especially in very partisan districts that are considered safe, that is a very unusual thing to have happened. And so I don't suspect that Thomas Massey perceived that it was something that could legitimately occur. And as far as keeping his mouth shut, he did. He didn't really criticize Israel at all until AIPAC came after him, until a lot of Zionists started coming after him. He always tried to rhetorically couch it in, I'm against foreign aid for anyone. I'm against the U.S. military supporting anyone doing anything that is aggressive militarily in nature and doesn't redound to America's benefit.
Massey was also one of the few Republicans to vote against Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and he cited the impact on the national debt that act had. And I think that's what really got attracted the ire of Trump. And then we mentioned the Epstein Files Transparency Act, and then Massey's general opposition to the Iran war. I think all of those things became too much for Trump to tolerate.
I critique that a little by framing it, by the way that it's framed there. I don't think it was too much for Trump to tolerate. I think, to the contrary, Massey was able to ankle bite Trump a lot more in the first term and in 2024 up until 2026, because up until the first round of Iran bombing, the one that happened in the summer of 2025, up until that point, Trump had not entirely consolidated the Republican Congress, both Senate and House, behind him. In 2016, obviously, had enormous opposition within his own party. And that plagued his entire first term. In the second term, he had more buy-in, but there were still the kvetchers like the Marjorie Taylor Greens and the Thomas Masseys. All of those people now, every single one of them, have been purged. Thomas Massie was the last one. There is really no opposition to Trump among GOP Congress people or senators. And you could maybe argue that John Cornyn was one in Texas, and he also just went down. And so it looks like, not that Trump can't tolerate this opposition, but Trump is now conducting, in political terms, a sort of military mop-up operation where the last vestiges of anti-Trump sentiments, of anti-Trump forces, are being driven out and being defeated. And it really is entirely Trump's party, at least at a congressional level.
And Senator Tom Tillis, I believe, from North Carolina, is not running for re-election, and he's one of the more vocal oppositional Republican figures to Trump. And then Bill Cassidy, the senator from Louisiana, just lost his primary. So yes, I echo Ness's point about Trump mopping up and consolidating his Republican base. It's also interesting that that is occurring at the same time where, if we can believe polls, which Ness certainly does in general, it seems pretty uniformly that the polls indicate that Trump's approval rating is the lowest it's ever been in either of his two terms among the general population.
Yes, but not among Republicans. That loss in popular support is almost entirely attributable to his loss of support among political independents.
Yeah, it's the Joe Rogan contingent, I think, that has experienced the biggest drop in support for Trump, but that would be my guess.
And those two things reinforce one another. As the absolute share of the total electorate that supports Trump drops off, those who are going to drop off are going to be the ones who tend to be the least reflexively and stridently loyal to Trump. So as the Republican Party shrinks electorally, Trump's hold on the Republican Party is going to strengthen. His grip is going to strengthen. And this is, of course, we are going to, I think these words will ring especially true when we look at the aftermath of the midterms coming up in November, the consequences of Trump having such a stranglehold on the Republican Party and what that means for Republican prospects in the midterms. But as what has happened to the senators in Louisiana and in North Carolina, and what Marjorie Taylor Greene saw as the writing on the wall, and what happened to Thomas Massie, shows that even if it does result, this consolidation of the Republican Party under Trump, even if that does result in a shrinking of the GOP representation in the total electorate nationally, it is politically suicidal to go against Trump for Republicans.
Back in March 2025, when Trump threatened to primary Massie, Massie responded by saying, quote, "Someone thinks they can control my voting card by threatening my re-election. Guess what? Doesn't work on me. 3 times I've had a challenger who tried to be more MAGA than me. None busted 25% because my constituents prefer transparency and principles over blind allegiance," end quote. Unfortunately for Massie, I think he had a inaccurate read of his constituents because it does appear, at least from my reading, that his constituents by and large did prefer blind allegiance over transparency and principles. And earlier this year, Trump gave an interesting description of what he needed from the race. Trump said at a joint appearance with Gallrein, quote, "I wanted just give me somebody with a warm body to beat Massie. And I got somebody with a warm body, but a big, beautiful brain and a great patriot." He was referring, of course, to Gallrein. So, regarding Gallrein, back on May 16, 2016, which was 2 weeks after the RNC announced Donald Trump as the Republican Party's presumptive presidential nominee, Gallrein changed his voter registration from Republican to independent, and he remained a registered independent throughout Trump's entire first term. and then only re-registered as a Republican after Joe Biden was elected president in 2020.
Yes, two things to say in response to that. One, Trump is clearly making a power move here, making sure that Gallrein understands that he is, at this point in time, if he is going to win, and of course Trump always thinks positively and presumes that he is going to win. So when Trump is making that assessment, when he is so flatteringly referring to Gallrein as a warm body, he is making it clear to Gallrein that when he wins, if he wins, but when he wins, it will be because of Trump's support of him. And Trump doesn't forget those kind of slights. Even though he realizes that Gallrein is an ally now, you can see, or you can hear in the way that he diminishes, kind of publicly gelds Gallrein in that instance, that he doesn't completely forget, and he is implying to Gallrein that he hasn't forgotten and that Gallrein owes everything to Trump. This is a very Caesar-like move where he is granting clemency, but with that grant of clemency is an insinuation, an implication that Trump has the stronger position, because of course in this case he really does have the stronger position. And two, it also underscores what we were talking about previously, how this is not, Gallrein is the perfect exemplar of that non-MAGA Republican, and he is the elected representative of the 4th District of Kentucky. So this is a district, underscoring the point that we made earlier, that is not a typical Republican MAGA district, but now Trump has total political control over it.
But I can't quite fit all the pieces together, because this non-MAGA Republican district elected a guy whose entire campaign was, I will be blindly loyal to Trump.
Yes, and this is something that wouldn't have happened 6 or 8 years ago when Gallrein was confident in publicly opposing Trump, because a lot of the constituents in the 4th District of Kentucky would have done the same. But now this is evidence that Trump has effectively consolidated political control in the Republican Party. Now, another way to look at this is that Trump, and this is something that I am certainly partial to, this understanding that Trump has in fact been converted. Trump is the one who has been flipped. And so now it's not so much that it's Trump's party, or it may be Trump's party in terms of getting personnel in position, but in terms of the driving ideology, it is actually the never Trump wing of the Republican Party that is now ascendant in terms of the actual priorities of the Republican Party in office. And as evidence for that, you need simply look at the people who surround Trump now, who are Trump's biggest cheerleaders. They are, to a man, or almost to a man, with the one notable exception mentioned last week of Stephen Miller, almost to a person, they are anti-Trumpers in the first Trump administration, and they were almost, again, to a man, Ron DeSantis supporters ahead of the 2024 Republican presidential nominating process. The Lindsey Grahams, the Mark Levins, the Ben Shapiros, the Ed Gallreins. So the question is, did Trump flip all of them, or, as seems more likely from my perspective, that they flipped Trump? Or merely that Trump was just a political opportunist from the get-go, and in 2016, the only path was to be antagonistic towards the party establishment, whereas in 2024, in the second term, the path forward to actually enacting agenda items was to, instead of fighting constantly with the power structure in the Republican Party, instead going along with it while still bringing a lot of the street cred that he had as a populist outsider from the first administration, and also from the failed re-election bid and the assassination attempt. And by the by, in terms of what may have flipped Trump, if that is what happened, it very well could have been said assassination attempt or assassination attempts.
I'm not exactly sure how you pronounce Gallrein's name. I'm going to try to say Gallrein. That's the pronunciation I could figure out. So the Massie-Gallrein primary was the most expensive congressional primary in American history. And the figure I saw was $32.6 million in advertising spending. and that surpassed the previous record, which was in 2024, when AIPAC, which is AIPAC, the American Israeli Political Action Committee, spent $14.5 million to unseat Democratic Representative Jamal Bowman of New York. Now, Bowman is a black man from New York, and I think they found another black man who was more pro-Jewish, pro-Israel, who was able to defeat Jamal Bowman, but they appeared to have deployed the similar playbook in Kentucky that they did in New York a couple years ago. People like Tucker Carlson portrayed the primary as just this massive amount of money on the Gallrein side, and it's kind of a David and Goliath scenario where Gallrein is Goliath and Massie is David. But in reality, Massie raised a lot of money as well. His campaign raised $5.54 million directly. That was actually more than Gallrein's $3.16 million. That's in direct fundraising. But on the outside money, Gallrein definitely dominated, and that's where the disparity was certainly decisive. The pro-Gallrein groups spent more than $19 million. The pro-Massie outside group spent about $5.5 million.
And the important distinction between the two, of course, is that campaign contributions directly to the candidate are limited. Per election cycle, that individual donation is capped at $3,300. And so when it comes to individual small donors, Massie had close to a 2-to-1 advantage over Gallrein. But when it comes to the big money, which came overwhelmingly from Zionists, the three big pro-Zionist Jewish Americans that we talked about in last week's recording, the big money, and that is the institutional money, that is the money from people in power. That's where Gallrein outraised Massie by more than 4-to-1. And so this is an illustration of how institutional support beats popular support virtually every time.
So Tucker's statement on the Massie primary was typical Tucker, indirect insinuations, plausible deniability. But I think in refreshing contrast, another major Massie supporter named Tom Woods, who's a libertarian commentator who has a podcast and a daily newsletter. He sent out a newsletter on May 20th. I'm quoting from that. "The boomers of Kentucky embarrassed the United States on the world stage yesterday. Around the world, people genuinely wondered, can an American politician survive who doesn't repeat low IQ platitudes about Israel and the Middle East? The boomers, with their heterodox Christianity and Fox News propaganda, gave their answer. Republican politics is dominated by people who for some reason still think Sean Hannity is a smart guy and Mark Levin is a constitutional scholar. Pat Buchanan had given them the example of the learned and articulate right-winger, and Pat was well to the right of Hannity and Levin, but they decided to go with Tommy Lauren and Dan Bongino instead. Oh, Massie voted this way or that, people will say, and that's why he was targeted in this unprecedented way. Yet there's Donald Trump out there campaigning for pro-amnesty Mike Lawler, so I don't believe you that this is a question of Massie's voting record, which is stellar, by the way. If that were true, Trump would have waged all-out war on Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski long ago. Even if Massie had had a handful of objectionable votes, a million times more important than any Massie vote is this principle. A patriot who values his country's sovereignty cannot allow three socially leftist billionaires who represent a foreign interest to buy a congressional seat and place a ridiculous empty suit in it. Jumping ahead a little bit in Tom Wood's statement, quoting again, but since we're not completely dense, we know the real reason Massie could not be tolerated. As Glenn Greenwald put it, if the AIPAC/Adelson crowd wants someone out of Congress for disloyalty to Israel, they will be out of Congress. There are a few exceptions due to unusual districts, but not many. The Israel lobby has unlimited funding and will spend limitlessly to expunge the blasphemous.
While directionally that resonates with me, the quip about Trump, had he really been concerned predominantly with immigration enforcement, would have waged all-out war on Susan Collins or Lisa Murkowski, is pretty silly. Of course, Trump backing those two senators in states, especially in the case of Susan Collins, in states where Trump is not particularly popular himself, would not have near the effect on the outcome that Trump throwing his weight behind Gallrein in a plus 18 Republican district in flyover country would. But while I say that that resonates with me at an intellectual level, at a somewhat misanthropic level too, because ultimately that is what a criticism of democracy often is rooted in, is a misanthropic streak, or at least an understanding that the affairs of state are something that cannot be left to the general public to decide without disaster resulting. But the reality of this political contest and a lot of the other ones that Tom Woods is talking about here is that the people who he despises, who he calls low IQ and the like, are the people who have figured out how to wield power, while he's figured out how to enrich himself by taking money from his supporters and changing absolutely nothing in the real world. That's a harsh criticism, but that's what all of these critics do. They all become quite personally wealthy by having people join their Patreon and send them money and donate to them and feel good because they're sticking it. They have someone who's echoing their sentiments on a larger stage, sticking it to the man verbally, but never actually affecting any real change, being able to exercise any real power at all. And the reality is that soon Thomas Massie is going to be another one of those people who are going to do exactly that. Tom Woods also wrote, Thomas Massie should hold his head high. He stood up against the machine time and again, knowing that it could one day lead to this. That is a little bit dramatic, I think. Thomas Massie, in his defeat speech, and the speech that he gave after he conceded the election to Gallrein, didn't seem particularly upset about it. And that this is a problem that dissidents consistently and perpetually and forever find ourselves in, which is that they don't really want power that badly. He didn't seem that distraught because life is going to be easier now that he's not contending for power. He's going to be able to ride this notoriety, as I said, to an independent Rumble show, and he'll be able to continue the gravy train of personal donations to his campaign. Those are going to continue to support him as someone who is out of Congress. But this disdain for obtaining power by whatever means necessary to obtain that power is why people like Tom Woods and Thomas Massie are always on the losing end of these contests. And it's the rare exception when they are able to win. And it's easy to trick yourself with somebody like Thomas Massie thinking that he's able to win in the 4th District of Kentucky, something that is in flyover country that doesn't attract a lot of attention from the coastal elites or from any of the institutional power centers, that, hey, we did it there, so we can do it in other places. But the reality is the only reason he was allowed to exist there is because he didn't have any power in the 4th District of Kentucky. And when he became a gadfly and he was targeted, he was defeated. And so while, as I said previously, the sentiments that Tom Woods is expressing here resonate with me, and that is why I'm being so critical of him, because I feel, and I think I speak for Jeff to a large extent here, that we are of a like mind. But this is a problem. This is the principal loser problem. And if there ever are going to be effective dissident changes brought to bear, we have to get rid of this allergy to doing what it takes to achieve and hold power, and simply disdaining those who are able to utilize power effectively to win, be it by dirty tricks or just by being dishonest or politically manipulative, or being able to figure out how to be the puppet masters for the ignorant voting public. If that is disdain, is that is something that is held in contempt, then effectively what that is conceding is that doing what it takes to obtain power is something that is beneath us. And so we will continue to be principled losers into a lot of Tom Woods readers and supporters, that has real consequences. Maybe it doesn't have the same sort of consequences as Tom Woods, who's become quite wealthy off of his readers. There are independent dissidents who are able to forge quite comfortable lives for themselves by taking money voluntarily given by other sympathetic dissidents in the general population, thereby making those other dissidents slightly poorer to make the one dissident quite rich. But if those masses of dissidents, such as they are, as massive as dissidents can be, if those dissidents take those same positions into the institutional framework of the managerial state as it exists in globo homo in the current year in 2026, they are going to be obliterated by trying to bring those positions into a world outside of independent media creation. And this is a big problem. I am frustrated just talking about it because I don't have a solution. I don't know what the answer is to it. But it seems to me obvious that this is not the answer. Just lamenting the fact with an air of superiority at the same time, lamenting the fact that we got beaten again by these dirty, cheating swindlers who figured out how to obtain power, but we are able to at least say that our hands are clean, even if those hands don't possess the One Ring. And that'll do it for us this week. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.